Welcome to Insights into Success, where with your host Paul Dodds, we hope to educate, inspire and motivate you to achieve your own personal success. We talk to guests from all around the world from a variety of walks of life to hear the realities of their own journey to success. What challenges have they faced? How have they coped with failure? And what have been the keys or will be the keys to their own success? In our Read to Succeed interviews, we talk books that have inspired our guests, and for some, they share their secrets to marketing success. Join us as we give you insights into success.
Welcome to Insights into Success. I appreciate you taking the time to join us on this podcast. I know that you'll have your hands full at the moment. You represent businesses throughout New Zealand, and that's no easy task, I'm sure, particularly at the moment. But could you kick it off just by giving us a bit of an appreciation of the diversity of your members that you advocate for?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity. We cover, we have a direct relationship with about 200 of New Zealand's largest businesses, listed and some of them private, and through a shareholder network of organisations, some of them chambers, some of them not, around the country. You know, we're connected to a lot of small businesses, so there's around 20 to 30,000 individual members through that network. And then we have an affiliated industries group. So that's 80 industry groups, which are part of the Business New Zealand network. And all of that adds up to about 80,000 New Zealand businesses that we connect into and kind of work with, both at a industry sector and individual level.
Wow. And so with COVID, like from what I've seen, it seems to be like a tale of two experiences at the moment, that we've got some industries that will reflect on this time as being some of their best times for business, whereas we've got others that will reflect upon it being a time of major upheaval and destruction. Is that what you're seeing within your community, that you've got that real sort of inequality between different industries?
Yeah, I mean, clearly those industries which rely on a lot of personal contact or international travel, tourism, retail, hospitality, those industries are struggling. Whereas if you're an international exporter of food or commodities, there's still been strong demand, and you're seeing that Fonterra is still doing very well. Even construction, a lot of demand within New Zealand for construction services and infrastructure building. One of the things that has happened to exacerbate that inequality, I think, is as New Zealand's borders shut, you start to see and people leave, you start to see quite a strong competition for skilled labour. And right. So if you're a smaller organisation, it's potentially quite hard for you to compete in that situation, and we saw demand, I think, hold up generally well, except in those areas that I talked about who have been particularly hard hit through lockdowns and through the border closures and the impacts of those. But demand has held up, and so for quite a lot of sectors, and in fact it's continued to grow, but their challenge has been to get people. So even if you're in a sector, or if your business is going really well, you're still impacted by constraints that have been probably exacerbated by COVID, and that is labor and skill shortages and being able to get goods into the country.
There's
been impacts. They've been different impacts, and some have been growing pains as opposed to shrinking pains.
And so for those industries that have been challenged, to what extent is it just a case that they need to either restructure or pivot? Is it really that simple? And, how comforting is it to industries to be told, that they just need to get on with it when other industries are doing well, that they kind of potentially might go under the radar or not get as much assistance as maybe what they need, because there's so much talk about pivoting and just getting on with things.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's been incredibly challenging, and for tourism, like there's different parts of the tourism sector. So there's the outbound part of the tourism sector, which really accommodates people, New Zealanders travelling offshore. Now that has been decimated. hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs lost in that. It's hard for them to continue because there's no market for their product, which is outbound travel services, and so that's really, really hard. I mean, a lot of those people who were working in that industry have gone into to work in other industries, and there isn't really right now, particularly with the advent of Omicron, another variant, and the potential that the border remains closed for even longer periods of time. There isn't really a pathway out for them at the moment, so it's very difficult for them to just pivot because they can't. There's nowhere for them to pivot to. There are businesses that were heavily reliant on inbound tourism, and a lot of those businesses have restructured themselves to cater to a domestic, captive domestic market, because of course without New Zealanders travelling offshore and no one coming in, New Zealanders are travelling more around the country. So they have changed their business models somewhat, changed the structure of their workforce, and sometimes the structure of their offerings to cater to a much more domestic market. So nevertheless, when lockdowns happen in Auckland, Queenstown suffers. It's not getting any inbound travellers, and it's not getting any people from Auckland. So it struggles, and that will be true for places like Rotorua, Taupo. So places that really rely on, who have been relying on New Zealanders moving around, really hard for them at the moment, with 1/3 of the country still locked behind a boundary. So it's had an impact significantly, and I think it's trite to say that industries can pivot. I think there's been businesses that you've seen flourish because they have been able to. They've had the capital to be able to adjust. I mean, I think about, and it's accelerated probably the profile of their of what they were doing, how they were going to shift anyway. The Warehouse Group's an example of that, where it's got a significant online presence now. It's gearing up to compete with businesses that'll operate in New Zealand like Amazon, and it was moving in that direction anyway, but it's moved much faster and much more deeply with its digital offering.
So, do you have any sense from feedback from your members to understand, to what extent COVID's taking both a psychological and a financial toll on SMEs?
Well, certainly both of those. Particularly, we have extended periods of lockdown. Look, this last kind of lockdown in Auckland has been, I think, because it was the fifth one, been really, really hard for businesses here. Been hard psychologically for business owners and for people working in businesses. Working from home has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages, particularly if you're dislocated from people. And humans are social creatures, and even if sometimes you don't want to be, and as a result, you lose a bit of team. The dynamisty of a team when they're not together. So I think one thing that we're thinking about as the Business New Zealand Network is what are the longer term kind of mental health implications of what New Zealanders, business owners and employees have been through for the last 2 years in different ways, and how we can cater to that. And the EMA, who's one of our shareholders and one of the businesses that I referred to earlier, they were instrumental in working with a group of Auckland business leaders to get some mental health support into the region for businesses, and particularly for small and medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, I mean, just trying to put yourself into their position. If you're a small business, you're locked down for an extended period of time with either no ability or limited ability to generate an income. It's a business that maybe you've created and worked in for years. Pretty tough going when you're staring down the barrel, potentially maybe losing it, financially going backwards in a massive way. I mean, pretty hard to cope with.
Yeah, extremely. And we've seen the consequences of some of that with people in that situation where they will have, where they would have lost their businesses that have been built up over years. I mean, we saw that particularly. We've seen that particularly in the travel industry. As I said, the outbound sector decimated, and parts of the inbound sector, pretty limited in terms of that. So those businesses were built over long periods of time. The relationships and the skills that they had within those businesses have probably been lost to that industry. So you have to figure out how to recreate that when the borders open. But the long-term psychological impacts of people losing their businesses is pretty significant.
And do you think, to some extent, it's a bit like when you have, a major tragedy, that the people just focus on getting through, but once they get through, once it's over, that's can be the danger time. They're in survival mode to get through, but it's after that, once that's passed, that where potentially it can become all too consuming at that point in time. Is that what you expect will potentially happen? Is that something that often is a pattern that is followed?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're pretty conscious of that, and one of the things that we think about is some of the longer term implications of what went on with people during and after the Christchurch earthquakes, because that had a long tail of people's mental health deteriorating as a consequence of a lot of things that we're talking about, jobs, families, human life lost as well, and businesses lost, and it turns up in a whole lot of different ways. So one of the things that we have been conscious of is having tools available to people to manage this in a short, medium, and long term way, because you're right. What might happen, and inevitably will happen, is some people will respond now and go through a lot of trauma and some significant negative mental health outcomes, and for some people that will be delayed, and it will evidence itself in different ways. That's certainly the experience of some of our colleagues from Canterbury, and they've done some great work in helping develop tools to recognise that for business owners, for themselves, and within their workplaces with the people that they're working with.
Out of interest, to what extent do you have the ear of the government, and if you do you feel that they take on board, the messages that you're feeding through to them from your members, and particularly in terms of the prospect of having another lockdown sometime in the future?
Yeah, look, I mean, well, one observation I'd make that so Business New Zealand, this government operates in a tripartite fashion. So what does that mean? There are two social partners in the government. The social partners are the combined trade unions and Business New Zealand. So we certainly have the opportunity to help create thinking around policy. And we have an opportunity to engage with the government, a lot of opportunity. The question is, it's still a very Labour-oriented government, and that's fine. So business is not always going to get things that it asks for or thinks that should be put in place. And sometimes, I mean, we hear that some frustration from the business community in that regard. However, I'll just give you a practical example. We approached the government alongside the CTU only about 6 weeks ago and said, look, we need a bit more clarity and certainty around what's going on with these vaccine mandates, and what's going to happen in workplaces. And so they moved pretty quickly to try and solve as many of those problems as they could, acknowledging that they won't all be solved, to be honest. One of the criticisms we had is that it took us to write a combined letter, but we would have hoped that there had been some policy thinking going on before that. Given, you can anticipate what's going to happen. At that stage, I think we had still quite low vaccination numbers, And so knowing that some businesses are going to be mandated, other businesses are not going to be mandated, some businesses are going to want to mandate themselves. How do you get through that clearly and easily? And as I say, you know, we managed to, I think, get to an okay place by working with the CTU and approaching the government, but you know, it should have been done much earlier.
And at the moment, in light of obviously what's going on, have you found that the CTU has been easier to work with? Have they been more willing to work with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally around COVID-related issues, you know, they've been pretty responsive, and you know, they obviously take a slightly different perspective to us, but at the same time, actually, it's about kind of the way that we've both approached it is kind of making sure that people in the workplace were supported as much as that is possible, making sure businesses are supported and that jobs are supported, and then the third part of it is making sure people, the things that can keep people safe are put in place as quickly as possible. So yeah, I think they've been pretty constructive to work with, and I think that's quite important. That relationship is really important. You know, they're an important social partner, and you know, look, that's not going to suit everybody from a business perspective, but you know, it does mean that there is when you're thinking about policy, it makes it a little bit more robust.
Right,
again,
absolutely.
the challenge for that though is, you know, businesses aren't always going to get everything that they want.
No, it's about compromise.
Yeah.
So at the moment, outside of the warehouse example, you know, have you seen examples of where businesses are actually responding to challenges that they're facing at the moment, or industries, and thriving? Have you got any sense of that? Outside, obviously, you've talked about the warehouse, but are there other examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably use a couple of examples. I mean, where product markets have held up, you know, from a commodities perspective, you know, businesses have been able to operate pretty freely and deliver to those markets. Those businesses have flourished, and those sectors are predominantly in the food and other commodity sectors. What else have we seen? Probably a move, not dissimilar to what you saw with the warehouse, but where businesses have capital to be able to deploy. You've seen probably automation as a recognition that that COVID has not necessarily created skill shortages, but certainly exacerbated skill shortages. A couple of areas where I think that there is still significant opportunity is certainly in the health sector. You know, so there's private sector health businesses that are working really hard to be able to transform what they do to automate some of the things that they can do and digitize some of the things that they can do, because they're recognizing that A, it may well be safer, and B, that's a response to, for example, the skill shortages that they're seeing. One of the things that we did in relation to the skill shortages in the health space was talk to the government about, you know, how they could change some policy settings to keep more people in New Zealand, and that was around sort of changes to the immigration settings, which were, you know, getting pretty tight for people in the healthcare sector. We were losing people who were on whose visas were expiring. We weren't able to keep them because the government was only rolling over those visas for short periods of time, and people simply had no certainty. So they've moved to create certainty for those people in those industries, and therefore we've been able to retain them where there's a real need for, you know, human care. So that's quite important. But again, you know, the move is around how can you use different technologies to replace some of those things, noting that you know, of course, we're going to be constrained from a human resource perspective, I think, for a little bit of time yet.
And like, to what extent are your members planning and expecting that changes in buyer behaviour imposed by COVID will actually become permanent? To what have you got any sort of sense of that? To what extent people are contemplating that some of the changes, like specifically buying online, is probably here to stay at the levels it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for certainly businesses that have responded to that have started to measure that. I mean, it's quite hard though, because we've kind of been in and out of lockdowns, so in some places, or in and out of alert level changes. So the key thing in terms of responding for a longer period of time to what some of these trends are is actually getting a trend. And I think that's been one of the difficulties with COVID. It's, it hasn't really provided there have been different phases of it, and those phases haven't necessarily been long enough to provide what a long-term trend might be, other than, obviously, as we said, a bit of online, or quite a lot of online. But that's really, those responses were to longer term trends in any case. What COVID did accelerate that and enable it, because suddenly everyone was online. So now those businesses that have been able to do that and respond quickly and put strong processes around that, have, they can create that as a more permanent feature of their business. There's no doubt that part of, for example, retail is going to continue, but it's, so just one example, buying clothes online, that's fine, but there's always going to be a role for people to go into stores to try on clothes, right? So what the balance will be between the online experience versus the human experience, and then in order to understand that, you're going to need to see a bit more of a long-term trend. From that regard. Even in that space, you might be happy to buy a pair of shorts or a t-shirt online, but and if it doesn't fit, send it back and wait the time. But are you really going to be buying a high-end suit or something like that online? So it will really depend on the product market that the retailer or the business is in as well.
So what do you think are some of the positives that are potentially going to come out of COVID? Because I'm sure there will be some evolution and some positive outcomes will be achieved. So can you sort of speak to maybe what some of those might be?
Yeah, I think one observation that I'd make is there are a group of businesses that were able to, put quite strong balance sheets in place, recognizing that COVID might go on for a long period of time. So for those businesses that have strong balance sheets, there are certainly going to be opportunities in certain sectors. Some may be in their own sectors, some may be elsewhere. So I think what you might find is those larger, more capitalized businesses, have the opportunity to aggregate in industries. You're sort of seeing that in parts of hospitality, where the bigger, more capitalized groups are buying their competitors who might be smaller. So I think you'll see a bit more of that. So what does that mean? I mean, why is that a good thing? Well, it provides a business with a bit more scale, and it provides a business with probably less competition in the market. Not that that's a good thing, but from an business perspective, they're kind of buying their competition at an opportune time for them. So I think you probably see a bit of that in certain markets. I mean, I wonder what will happen in the construction sector, for example. Where we see, we might see some aggregation and a bit some stronger concentration in that sector. That would not be a bad outcome if you think about the scale of building that needs to happen in New Zealand. So those are kind of two examples. As I said, I think automation and digitization in the healthcare sector, in terms of services, health services, I think is another area. So those would be some observations.
And out of interest, what's your take on the whole thing of working from home versus in an office? Do you think that this is going to result in a permanent shift? And I think there was a bit of a shift happening anyway, but do you think it's going to result in a real permanent shift from people to work at home? Or do you think at some point there might be a bit of kickback and people will want to go back into the office for that socialization and just getting away from being in the same environment 24/7?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things are true, actually. I mean, what we're seeing is that businesses that sort of had de-geared from a property perspective to move to a kind of more full-on working from home model. I think they ran into some challenges, and one of the challenges that I think that wasn't foreseen is that within an office environment, for example, you're able to control the health and safety aspects of it. What we saw is that it's way harder for an employer to do that in a working from home situation. And in fact, you've got to kind of go into that. So just at a very practical level, I'm probably not working at the safest environment here, but what I mean is, you kind of have to have someone go in and assess the ergonomics of that office space in someone's home environment to make sure that you're not running risks as an employer. And I think a lot of that stuff might have been glossed over in the initial push to work from home. There's no doubt that flexible working was already here. It just wasn't here on the scale that we saw it. I mean, a couple of things that occurred is I think businesses geared up to be able to enable people with devices and connectivity to make sure that where it was appropriate, they could continue to partly work from home. What you saw, I think, was a shift to kind of more of a mixed model where you've got people in the office sometimes and people at home sometimes, and trying to gear your offices around that a little bit more so that you do not lose that the dynamism of teams in a social environment. And I think the other thing that I'll just observe is that it's easier to talk to a person. My observation, having been on Zoom a lot over the last 2 years, was initially, man, this is really easy. It's convenient. It's great. But doing it, what we found is that doing it for 6 or 8 or 10 hours a day is extremely draining for areas that aren't for in personal contact situations, or when you're kind of in a workplace or other environment. So I think there is probably some people who are thinking about how you kind of minimize the impact of overexposure to the digital technologies which enable working from home as well, so that people also get time and space to do work as opposed to just be on Zoom and conduct meetings. Also, I mean, it's quite easy to switch off from a Zoom meeting if there's a range of participants and you're not necessarily an active part of that conversation. Whereas if you're in the room, it's pretty hard to switch off.
More obvious.
Yeah. So again, I think there's certainly and there's been an enablement in terms of this working from home and a progression in it. But I think there's also been a bit of a retraction in that space as well.
Yeah. And do you think though, with us having been locked down for so long, that we'll actually crave to be around our colleagues for a change after being at home all this time?
Yeah, I think that's right. And what will happen again is, people will go back to the office for a while, and then they'll make a determination about what works for them from a flexibility perspective. And I think with skills shortages, what will happen is employers that are able to offer that flexibility will probably have a significant advantage, and not only offer it but support it. So I think that will certainly become more of a feature of the competitive environment around employment. And, if you think about the time you save, as I said, I was kind of outlining some of the negatives of kind of being online for long periods of time, but there are, significant savings from a time and efficiency perspective by not having to travel for long periods of time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, like, parking COVID now, just can you give me some idea, how does New Zealand rate compared to the rest of the world in terms of your ability to do business in New Zealand? How do we stand up to comparison?
Yeah, it's quite interesting when, if you talk to a business audience, you'd think it was really hard to do business in New Zealand. And look, even ex-COVID, people would say there's too much compliance, there's too many rules, all of this sort of stuff. So New Zealand consistently rates, number one or number two let's just say within the top 5 of ease of doing business on the global index for ease of doing business. And it's easy to start a business here. And it's kind of harder to close a business. You got to go jump through a few more hoops. But I mean, I do think that I do think what we've argued for is more consistency and clarity in terms of rules around doing business and simplicity, so that where there's crossovers, you remove them. But if you're doing business in France or you're actually anywhere in Europe, you're probably having to comply with the multitude of overlapping rule sets related to where you're operating, whether that's a national, regional, or local set of rules. Now, for some businesses in New Zealand, that's true for from an RMA perspective or from a local planning perspective. But certainly, it's simpler here than in places like Europe or even parts of the US.
And so I'm interested to get your perspective. Like, how do you think we sit in terms of our supportiveness of entrepreneurs in New Zealand, and specifically when they fail? How do you think we rate in that regard in terms of supporting them and dealing with failure?
Yeah. I think probably a couple of points that I make is that business in general in New Zealand from a cultural perspective is, I think business is getting a better rap than it has, but it's still, there are still parts of New Zealand that see kind of businesses as inherently being bad. And I think that's just simply the wrong way to approach it. So there's a cultural trait that I think that it can be inhibiting. Nevertheless, good entrepreneurs, throw that stuff off on a daily basis and continue to be successful. Now, what happens when they're not successful? Well, again, what happens is, culturally we'll say, oh, well, that all that capital's been wasted. You ripped those investors off. You screwed it up. You're a disaster. And because we're a small country, those entrepreneurs will probably suffer a bit in quite a public way. Culturally, we need to probably move past that from a maturity perspective and say, and again, look, seasoned entrepreneurs are used to winning and they're used to losing, and they mostly have resilience around those things. But for young entrepreneurs, we need the opportunity to create resilience around failure for them and ensure that there is proper support in place, because actually failure is a core part of success. Until you've had a few failures, you don't know, you might not know what's what's gone wrong. You need to be able to learn, and I think that's part of a cultural trait that we also have in our learning and education processes, or we have had historically, where you won't put your hand up in case you get the answer wrong. Now that's not a way to engender a culture of entrepreneurship. And as I said, look, entrepreneurs by their nature tend to be able to throw that stuff off. But we could do more culturally to think about how we support that, in a range of different ways, whether that's public policy, whether it's the media. We've actually got quite a concentrated and relatively small, but I think strong sort of business media in New Zealand, and we could probably improve that as a way of providing better kind of support. Yeah, so those would be the kind of comments I'd make around that.
Yeah, because it always seems to me that if I compare, like, say, New Zealand and England to, like, America, I mean, we're so influenced by our heritage, our English heritage, that we are very conservative. And I'm not purporting that everything that America does is right. And I'm not saying that they all are like that. But generally, like, if you're, say, in a startup and you fail in America, generally speaking, that they would see that as a good experience, something you would have learned a lot from and make you better prepared for the next time around. Whereas here, it seems like in the same situation, if you failed, the general norm here is to see that as a big cross against your name. You know, you don't really know what you're doing, obviously, and probably best not to give you any more money because you'll probably lose that as well. And to me, that's a very inhibiting way to perceive things.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, because you've had a pretty easy way to make money, which has been property investment, and that doesn't come without risks in and of itself. But there'll be a generation of people who probably haven't seen property losses, for example, and I think so. When you see losses in investment, that's harder to take, and again. I don't think social media helps that in a small country. You will get a pile-on, and I mean, I think, as I said earlier, it's hard to create and engender a culture of entrepreneurship. But one of the ways that you can do it is, I mean, I think you referred to sort of our cultural history, part of our cultural history. I think that's changing massively, actually, because I think there are 146 different ethnicities in Auckland. So with that diversity comes an opportunity to have different expressions of success and failure, and also different understandings about risk. And so with ironically, this sort of government wants to really clamp down on migrants, and ironically, I say ironically because what there have been a range of studies, including by the Productivity Commission, which indicate that migrants coming into New Zealand, by and large, contribute from a economic perspective more than New Zealanders who are living in New Zealand. So, so that cultural diversity, I think, is really, really important in changing the way that we think about and engender entrepreneurship, and also the way that we think about success and engendering success. That's not to say that people aren't going to be pissed off if they lose money. I mean, that's just natural, frankly. And so it should be. So make sure that there's plenty of information about that you understand the risk in the investment that you're making. And I think that's another issue that is potentially part of the challenge in New Zealand. Reasonably low levels of financial literacy. So we kind of, that's a really hard one to fix in a short period of time. But helping people understand the nature of investments. I mean, one of the things that I would say is that as kind of New Zealand has a real dynamism at the moment in the technology space, and you're seeing that with a range of platforms being developed. And if I think about this financial literacy issue, sitting someone down and sort of talking them through a balance sheet and a P&L is one thing. Enabling them, especially kids, to be involved in seeing the features of success in a company, like through Hatch or Sharesies and things like that, and asking questions and being inquisitive about why is that company doing well, what's it producing, who's it selling it to, those sorts of things, and enabling them from a real life experience, because it's suddenly they've got $100 and oh man, today I've only got 50 and yesterday I had 100. What happened? And I think again, getting them to understand that there's a reason that they took a risky position on a company and they didn't know enough about it, and then they lost the money. So the earlier that we can help kids have those sort of experiences at a relatively low level, because it's often the parents' money.
That's right.
Then I think the more that you have that going on, and I see these platforms have been picking up, lots of customers, including younger people, which is really, really important, because that that enables the real shift in culture. It also enables, of course, a broader base for investment and for capital for some of those companies that we talked about. So there are more opportunities to get capital. There are more opportunities to understand what's going on with what you've invested, and therefore there's also should be more information about the investment that you're making. All of those things contribute to supporting entrepreneurialism and enabling us to kind of shake off some of that, the tall poppy stuff.
And just like in talking in terms of SMEs, where do you think there are gaps that we need to fill in terms of support for SMEs in New Zealand?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really difficult question to answer because a SME is a generic term, but each business is individual, and it will depend on kind of the nature of the business that they're in. I mean, for example, a startup tech company is going to be completely different to a new cafe, right? So I would say broadening our base of capital is one of the places where we have an opportunity. I mean, as a proportion of our GDP, our share market is quite small compared to a lot of Western economies. But enabling and increasing that profile is really critical. And again, all of those kind of learning tools, learning through doing tools, those investment platforms are really important for expanding that pool of capital. And that's the best support for SMEs, because what you don't want to do is take away, even though I referred to it earlier as, in a comment of removing competition, I think you need competitive markets to drive innovation and drive better ways, better kind of businesses. And so be very careful about what support you provide to businesses, because they should be able to rise and fall on their own merits. And if they can't, and they're requiring, say, for example, in particular, taxpayer supports, I'm not sure that's the best way that taxpayer funds should be deployed. And look, that comment aside, I mean, there are obviously specific instances where you do need support, and COVID is clearly one of those where you've got to, you've had some economic implications of a health pandemic. Now, no one would argue with the fact that taxpayer money needs to be deployed to help people retain their jobs and help businesses kind of work through what hopefully would have been a short-term thing with the first lockdown. We've kind of gotten, and the world's gotten through all of that stuff. So it's not that that there should be potentially long-term supports, but broadening the pool of capital, broadening the skill sets of people deploying capital, and the decision-making processes around the deployment of capital, I think is really, really critical. Because again, if you've got a burgeoning sector that no one can see the value in New Zealand, but you've got entrepreneurs in the US wanting to invest in, you're saying, what the hell's going on with our own investment community? Why aren't they sophisticated enough to understand the opportunity here? And we've seen a little bit of that. Particularly in kind of tech services would be my observation.
So I'm just interested to see your perspective, but to what extent do you think that small businesses are guilty of not spending enough time, and it's a bit of a cliche, but working on their business instead of in their business? Do you think that that's a common trait across a lot of small business owners in New Zealand?
I think it's probably. I think that may have been true. I think it's getting less and less true. And the reason for that is, there are more sophisticated people are becoming more sophisticated in the use of tools to assist them to work both in and on the business at the same time. So, developing strategic, business strategies, business plans, clear frameworks for success, and what you describe as accountability mechanisms for themselves within businesses. If they're not doing that, My observation would be they're likely to not survive, because what they'll be doing is using cash flow to survive. Now, business, that's perfectly fine, but if you don't have an end game around that, then you've got a problem. And so, I think, and there are more tools and resources available than ever before to kind of help businesses through that. And simpler tools would be my observation. You have to boil the ocean to develop a strategy and create a business plan and business cases for investment these days. But you need to do it, I think, in order to determine, is this something, if you're a business, should we invest in that extra bit of kit? Should we invest in those extra 10 tables? What is our market looking like? What's happening in the market? If you're not doing those things and you're only responding to what you're seeing on a daily basis, I think, again, you're probably putting your capital at risk.
Just out of interest, I don't have any information on it, but I know the government's had this initiative where they're trying to upskill SMEs on the digital side of things. Given that it's free, though, do you think that's a good thing or a negative thing? Do you think that having it as being free, that actually does encourage people to actually take it up and to actually follow through with it? Or is it actually a problem, the fact that it is free?
No, I mean, I think what that's designed to do is incentivize people to access use of digital technologies to help them with their business. Do I think it's a problem and it's free? No. What I'd hope, though, is it enables them to kind of accelerate the way in which they're thinking about the capital that they've put into that business and how they want to get their return on investment, and simplify the way that they're thinking about it by being able to use those tools and use them really efficiently and effectively. And I think that probably that's been one of the core inhibitors. You'll see that businesses that can do that really, really effectively and well will take off and have wider pools of capital available to them. Businesses that aren't doing that won't, and they'll find themselves struggling because they're less efficient. Right? These digital tools are designed to produce efficiencies, to make it possible for a business owner, a small business owner, to work in the business and on the business. And if you can't do both, then as I said, you're going to have a smaller pool of capital available to you. The people who are analysing your business will be able to analyse it in better ways than you can, and therefore that puts you at risk. Therefore, you've got competitive risk, you've got strategic risk, and you've got capital risk. So, if you're not taking advantage of the free stuff, I think it's probably a mistake.
Yeah, it's just interesting. It's human nature. I mean, I don't know the data on it. I'd love to know, but just in my experience and a lot of experience in marketing, often is that if something's given to you for free, human nature tends to be that there's no skin in the game, as it were. So it's very easy to put off doing it if it's a course in this case. Whereas if you paid a good amount of money for something, you kind of more incentivized, well, I better go do it because I've spent all this money on it. So I just would be interested to get some sort of feedback on to what extent the fact that it is free means that people kind of just don't ever quite get there. They have good intentions, but never quite get there on it.
Yeah, well, look, one observation I'd make is that, through the network where we have regional business partner arrangements and distribute funding for that. COVID has, and that's essentially sort of $10,000 or $5,000 to help you get business advice and so on. Yeah. And that's been taken up. That's been oversubscribed is how I would describe it. And so I think that's really important because people are recognizing that I don't know everything. I don't even know what my market might look like after we come out of this. I don't even know who's still living in the area because I've been in lockdown. I need to understand how to get data points and more of them more quickly so that I can respond to my business. I need to understand what my margins and individual products are that I'm buying and selling to run the business. And I can't do that all in my head or on a kind of Excel spreadsheet because it's highly manual. So I need to figure out ways to make that quicker, easier, and so on and so forth. So I think, a lot of businesses have taken up that advice, and I would expect that to be true with, the digital boost as well, even though that stuff is free, simply because they're saying, oh, wow, if I don't do this, something's going to be done to me.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope they are taking it up and taking advantage of it. But it'll be just interesting to know, just because experience with human nature and the way they can be. But I think that initiative with having the opportunity to get consultants in, I think that's great. And I think that would be very beneficial for sure, because you've got some third party coming in and interacting with you and really asking some hard questions of you and giving you some good guidance as to where you need to go with your direction. So whereas the digital learning one is very much self-paced, you do it when you want. So I'm not quite so sure or quite so convinced that people will necessarily follow through with it in quite the same way. But I definitely think that consultant initiative is a great one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, as you say, it'd be good to see the numbers and see how it's playing out. I mean, I think from a overarching digital strategy perspective, giving people some insights into what they. So I think the digital boost is not going to be the complete package. It'll give people insights into sort of advantages they might get out of being able to use digital technologies. And then the spur is to go and invest more in their own learning and in their systems and whatnot to be able to sort of, from a system perspective, be able to analyze things in a way that I just described earlier. And, those are kind of those will be some of the key things for business success, I think, going forward.
Okay, so Kirk, just to wrap this up, you represent a lot of industries, and I'm sure you probably noticed in, different industries, and it doesn't really matter what it is, but that you have similar businesses, you might have a multitude of businesses doing similar things, and the odd one or two really excel where the others just kind of carry on and maybe have a profitable existence, but they never really go anywhere. But the occasional one in the industry really takes off and goes head and shoulders above all the other competitors. From your experience, do you have any sense of what it is that might be some of the key ingredients why some businesses will just flourish while others might exist okay, but never go to the sort of the levels of performance that the one or two do?
Yeah, I think there's probably 3, 4, maybe 5 things. I'll go through what I think, and we'll see where we get to with the number. Look, I think some of the things that I outlined earlier, having a very clear strategy. What is it that you're there for? What's your purpose? And understanding that as a core part of understanding, therefore, what the skills are that you need in your business to drive it forward. And then the next part of that is having, leadership, which enables people to flourish as well. So understanding what the resources are that you need, and whether that's digital and human capability, it's almost inevitably going to be both of those things. So good leadership that can bring in great people, great leadership which can bring in great people. And as say then being willing both as at a governance level and at a management level to continue to test yourselves and have an environment where we've got a really robust environment for challenging ideas. Too often, I think one of the challenges in New Zealand is that we simply don't challenge ideas enough, or we don't have enough space to challenge ideas between ourselves, that we get into a kind of New Zealand passive aggressive thing. And I think that's really debilitating. You need to have a robust environment to fully interrogate ideas, because because without that, you might lose the next stage of your business, the next gem, the next opportunity, the next chance to grow, because what you've done is you've sat on what you've got, and you haven't thought, well, this isn't going to last forever, or you've thought this is going to last forever. And I think sometimes complacency can be a challenge. If you don't want to take your business to the next level because you're pretty happy with where it is, and you've got a strong customer base, and you know your product set well, and you know your customers well, and you feel you're happy with the profitability of your business, and if let's just say it's a small to medium-sized business, those types of things inhibit you being growing and becoming a bigger business. And so those kind of three things, I suppose. The fourth thing would be capital,
right,
and great governance and great and kind of great leadership around the table enable you to attract capital, would be my observation. And again, you need the broadest pool of capital available so that you can make some of these choices when they arrive on your door, if you've been doing the thinking and the analysis about what the future growth of the company looks like. And it's quite interesting. You have to, a lot of companies that in past that have been successful have had to really change the way that they do business, or even the business that they're in order to retain their kind of success. And that requires an immense amount of bravery from both shareholders and also people that are working in the business, and an incredible amount of belief. So in order to develop that, you've got to have a damn good strategy, and you've got to have a damn good understanding and consistency of understanding across teams. So I put it down to to sort of four things: having that strategy, having that high quality leadership that enables people to grow, and having good, strong governance that enables you to keep challenging yourself, and proper ways and spaces to do that, and then access to capital.
And just one final question, Kirk. To what extent do you see that businesses in New Zealand are being held back from growing through to staff shortages?
Yeah, look, I described that earlier as growing pains. I mean, I think it must be and it is immensely frustrating when you can see when you've got a market and you're growing, but you could be growing a lot faster when you can't get access to those skills. And those skills come from, predominantly from two places. They come from the domestic population, and they come from outside New Zealand. And so if the education system isn't providing what you need, and you can't have access to the skills that you need to get from offshore to help grow, that is a real inhibitor. And we've seen a bit of that. New Zealand has one of the biggest skills gaps. So one of the biggest skills gaps in the OECD. It's acknowledged that often what is needed by industry is not being pushed out by our education system, and there'll be some good reasons for that. I think some of that again is changing, but you can't at the moment. The borders closed. It's really hard to get people in. Even people that were here, skilled people that were here, were wanting to leave because the signalling wasn't strong enough from the government. And I think that's immensely frustrating. That's growing pains, and very much a real thing right now, actually, for businesses that are growing. So, it will hold us back if we can't get access to those things. So we need to be ambitious about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's only anecdotally, but the common discussion that I come across just talking with other people here in Auckland, business owners, the common complaint is that they just can't get staff. They put ads in the paper, however else online or what have you, and just they either don't get any applicants, or the applicants are just simply not suitable. So, there just seems to be a lot of issue out there, at least in Auckland, where business owners are frustrated that they've got the demand, but they can't meet that demand because they don't have the staff and they just can't find them.
It's all over the country. I can tell you, almost every region, prior to being locked down in Auckland, that myself and the team travelled to, this was probably the number one issue. Because again, the businesses that were growing were screaming. They're saying, like, we've got demand here. We want to take advantage of it. And it was quite interesting. Businesses that have been most successful responded in a number of different ways. They became closer to the education market, whether that was schools, polytechs, ITOs, whatever was going on. Those businesses started to latch onto the skills part of what was happening in their region. The second part was finding out, from MSD, whether there were people that were suitable to come into their business, forming stronger relationships with MSD officers, so that they could get those people into their business as early as possible, and thinking about what they were paying people as well, and they've had a lot of businesses have had to adjust to that as well, which is of course we're seeing that driving through an inflationary pressure. So businesses have responded to that. I think the ones that have been successful have been able to respond and use different mechanisms than they might have before. And again, there was probably a good discipline to have. You want diversity in your labour pool as well, I guess, as it's another form of capital, right? It's your human capital.
Yeah, I know. I certainly know from feedback from people, the challenge. What happens is when you aren't able to get the staff that you want, you're then challenged as to, do you hold on to people that aren't really culturally a good fit for you, or maybe from a skill base aren't really what you need? Do you do that? And make do, or do you go without? So that's definitely a challenge facing, I know, a lot of businesses in Auckland at the moment, where they've got that conundrum to deal with.
But yeah, I mean, I think I'd go back to my comments around that kind of treating people as human capital, and thinking about, so if you've got a person already in the business, they kind of know what the job is. What is it that you can do as a business owner, or a senior manager or employer, or whatever, to maximize the the opportunity for your business and for that person within it? And so it might be thinking about what additional training, how you might connect that person to developing a different skill level, in order to make a bigger contribution to your business that you feel like you're missing out on, so you can meet that demand. And I think that's another really important thing. We've been pushing quite hard for one thing that sort of hasn't been that well recognised is from a education funding perspective, has been workplace-based training. As part of the education system, it's way down here. And we're pushing hard to have it, more highly recognised in the way that it's funded, and also what's generated out of workplace-based training by way of skills recognition as well. Because again, the more you can close that skills gap with the people that are here, the better it is for New Zealand, and the better it is certainly for your business, but the better it is for New Zealand as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Kirk. It's been fantastic for you to take the time and talk to me. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we've got a challenging future ahead of us for sure. But I know in New Zealand, our businesses are pretty resilient, and that's a key ingredient to success. So long may that continue. And I'm sure in your capacity, you'll be doing what you can to support businesses. So thank you for your time.
Cheers. Thanks for the opportunity.